The question asked of us today is, what is the most important event in British history? This is an almost impossible question to answer, as there are so many events, large and small, that impact on us today. Some are thousands of years old, some happened a single generation ago. But one thing is certain though, important does not equal well known. Many key events have gone unnoticed by people, unrecorded by historians, and today I want to highlight one to you that I feel is important and key to the success of a more obvious historical event. Today I'm going to talk to you about the pipeline under the ocean, PLUTO, and without it, World War II could have had a very different ending. An overview of the PLUTO project can be seen on this short film from the War Archives. In it, you will hear an overview of the project, but what is missing is the personal elements which can only be imparted by those who were there, from whom we will hear in a little while.
One of the miracles of Allied supply, the English Channel pipeline, can now be revealed. Long lengths of flexible steel pipe carried part of the 1 million gallons of gas delivered daily from the Isle of Wight to the French coast. The original idea was conceived by British engineers, who also utilized lead piping somewhat similar to a submarine telegraph cable. 3 inches in diameter, the pipe was thoroughly insulated from sea action. Captured Nazi officers credited the undersea pipeline with being one of the main factors contributing to the downfall of the Wehrmacht. Following a test operation, cable ships began paying out the pipe soon after D-Day. Both lead and steel tubing, much of it made in America, were used to carry the vital fuel to our fighting fronts. The pipe, wound on huge drums 30 feet in diameter, was released while being towed across the channel. The Luftwaffe was missing on this occasion also, and the first line crossed in 10 hours. Near the tip of the Normandy Peninsula, the pipeline comes ashore. Altogether, 20 lines were soon providing a constant fuel supply. Carefully camouflaged buildings in the southeastern part of England hid pumping stations from enemy eyes. Delivered close to the actual fighting front, the fuel kept our planes, trucks, and tanks operating on the drive on Hitler's Reich.
In the months after D-Day, there was a need to supply the Allied armies with fuel. This meant that somehow fuel had to get from the supply tanks in the south of England all the way to France. The planned invasion of Europe would be the largest landing in history of amphibious vehicles, but a reliable supply of fuel would be needed to ensure that the vehicles could proceed as planned. The momentum of D-Day had to be maintained so that German forces could not regroup and fight back. But if the beaches were cluttered with tankers or traditional pipelines, the vehicles would not be able to land and the movements of men, weapons and materials would be blocked. Putting the pipeline into the English Channel was an innovative solution. Captain Frederick Wroughton is the last surviving officer from the PLUTO team, and the only member of the team who was there both at the laying down the pipeline and its salvage. In 1971, he was recalled to take charge of the recovery process when it was decided that the pipeline was just too valuable a scrap item to remain buried in the ocean. How many people were involved in the PLUTO project?
Hundreds. 2 factories.
Really?
Yes.
Cool. What was your role in the PLUTO project? What was your role?
I was first lieutenant of the HMS Lachlan.
Cool. How important do you think the project was to success of the war? Very important. And final question, what was the hardest bit of the project?
Then,
What was the hardest bit of the project?
really, I think perhaps starting to late the first time.
Okay.
Yeah, got everything right. After that, when you knew he was it lasted a lot easier. But the first one was a bit frightening. And it was 70 miles.
Really?
And sailed over to the Isle of Wight.
Storing oil and fuel near the channel was a risky plan. Any facilities would be open to attack by the enemy. So to reduce the risk, there was already a series of smaller pipelines under construction, which would take fuel from other facilities near Bristol and Liverpool to the channel, and this network would later be linked up to a planned pipeline on the Isle of Wight and Dungeness. If this series of planned pipeline could be adapted in some way, then there may be a way to fuel the Allies. But there was still the issue of how to reduce the attack to the homeland. The British would have to find some way to hide the buildings from air scouts to keep the plan secret and safe. To reduce the risk of attack, the terminals and pumping stations were heavily disguised as buildings that would seem normal to those scoping around the area. Bungalows, gravel pits, and even an ice cream shop. In the early part of 1942, Geoffrey Lloyd MP, who was in charge of the UK's fuel policy, met Chief of Combined Operations and other key advisors to consider the fuel supply issue. There was no off-the-shelf solution that did not invite the enemy to attack shore installations or slow pipelaying and support vessels. An idea was considered, a radical idea that seemed a simple concept that would solve all their issues. Submarine cables were easier and faster to lay than traditional pipeline. This cable would be adapted in the core replaced and adapted to transport fuel. Engineers, the National Physics Laboratory, and the Post Office took on the challenge to adapt the cable. The Post Office was used because they were the only people who had the cable laying facilities. It was a complex task, and there were many failures arising from the twist kinks in the cable. The cable would burst or collapse due to the external water pressure and other powerful forces. All in all, this project was a massive feat of engineering, which had to be completed in the turning of the tide. All possible land-based installations in the UK were in place in readiness for the invasion, and Operation PLUTO formally started on the 12th of the 8th, 1944, more than 2 months after D-Day. In August, PLUTO Minor was connected to the major system coming from the Isle of Wight via Cherbourg. It was incredibly dangerous. Warships acted as convoys to the cable-laying ships, and tugs could not be used if they interfered in the cable-laying process. At one point, the ship was 75 yards off the rocks of the coast. The pipe was a core of lead pipe. This was surrounded by 2 layers of prepared paper tape, a layer of bitumen, prepared cotton tape, then 4 layers of mild steel tape, a jute bedding, a layer of steel, armour wires, and finally an outer layer of overall jute serving. When the pipe was laid down, it had to be filled with water to prevent it from being crushed. This was then pushed out as the oil came through. The pipeline was laid down in 10 hours, all 70 miles of it. The pipeline was laid down so quickly because it had to be done before the tide turned and pushed the ships out to sea again, taking the pipeline with them. In 1971, the recovery process was started, as the scrap value of the line was so great. The recovery process was complex and slow. Captain Wharton was recalled and given the challenge of undoing all the previous work. There was no instructions and no guidance. It was all down to one man and his engineering skills. All but 1 mile was recovered and salvaged.
So I was thrown at the deep end. I hadn't a clue how to fit a cable system without to do it. Because nobody knew, and there was a lot of dockyard people who had no idea about cable systems, So I had the blueprint, and that was just, it wasn't really a blueprint, it was just a sketch of the ship. It was a good way to do it, because you didn't have to think, what should I do? You knew what you had to do. better as different cargoes went on, they got better.
Without the PLUTO project, D-Day would have failed. The war would have gone on much longer, and no one is sure where we would be today. The innovation of the engineers and the bravery of those who laid the cable ensured the victory for the Allies, and therefore I think this is one of the most important and unchampioned events in history.